does a multi-billion-dollar international debt crisis end up dictating the price of a single, bottle of water at your local Addis Ababa kiosk?
It's quite the journey, honestly.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're mapping out this hidden chain reaction. We are working right out of the newsroom at Addis Fortune, Ethiopia's largest English weekly newspaper. And just combing through the galleys for this week's edition, we're looking at the story slated for June 2026. You really start to realize that the chaos of the city isn't random at all.
Not even a little bit. When you place these seemingly isolated news stories side by side, you see this relentless cascade of cause and effect.
Right. Our mission today is to trace how a massive, abstract 2.3 trillion birr decision in Parliament trickles all the way down to the street corner. By the end of this deep dive, you'll see exactly how global supply chains, national debt, and local policies are intersecting to reshape your everyday life.
Because top-level macroeconomic strain directly translates into localized financial panic. It's inescapable.
Okay, let's unpack this starting right at the top with the national ledger. Because to understand the squeeze happening on the streets, we have to grasp the squeeze on the federal checkbook. Finance Minister Ahmed Shide recently walked into Parliament with a record-breaking 2.34 trillion birr federal budget.
Right, which on paper is the largest budget bill the country has ever recorded. The raw birr figures paint this picture of just explosive expansion.
It looks huge.
Oh, massive. Over recent years, we're looking at an average annual growth rate of about 51%. The budget went from 562 billion birr not too long ago, scaling rapidly, to this 2.34 trillion mark. It projects an image of a government armed with immense spending power.
Like they're ready to just fuel infrastructure and development across the board.
Exactly.
But, and this is the crucial part, once you translate that trillion birr figure into foreign exchange, the entire narrative flips. In dollar terms, the budget has only grown by about 2.8%. It's essentially been hovering between $13 and $14.7 billion for nearly a decade. It's like watching someone sprinting on a treadmill. The government is sweating more, stepping faster, churning through all this birr, but once you measure their actual forward progress in global currency, they're barely moving forward.
That's a perfect way to look at it. And what keeps the incline steep on that treadmill is old obligation. If you dig into the recurrent expenditure line, there's a category simply labeled Others.
Others, very descriptive.
Right. But it turns out that ambiguous label hides the bill's heaviest fiscal anchor, which is debt servicing. That line item alone amounts to 542.1 billion birr.
Wait, $500 billion birr just on debt?
Almost 30% of the total budget. Just paying the interest and principal on old debts consumes more than 36% of projected tax revenue before a single road is paved or a single teacher is paid.
Oh, wow. And on top of that, they're trying to balance $500 billion birr in regional subsidies just to keep the federation functioning, right?
Correct. Oromia requires about 34.5% of that subsidy pool, and Ahara follows with 21.6%.
So, to pay the old debts and subsidize the regions without enough tax revenue, they're leaning incredibly heavily on domestic borrowing. They're projecting around 329 billion birr in domestic debt.
And what's fascinating here is how that specific domestic borrowing figure physically alters the wider economy.
How so?
Well, when the federal government needs to borrow 329 billion birr at home, primarily by issuing treasury bills and government bonds, it steps into the financial market as the ultimate zero-risk borrower.
Right, because the government won't default on domestic debt.
Exactly. So commercial banks naturally prefer lending to a guaranteed entity like the state rather than taking a chance on a local business. The mechanism here is direct. The government actively crowds out private credit.
Which means this domestic borrowing doesn't just squeeze local farmers or small businesses. By vacuuming up all available capital, the government is inadvertently starving our biggest international players of the financing they need to survive global shocks. Let's talk about Ethiopian Airlines. They are a global titan, but right now they are scrambling to secure a 3-month fixed-price fuel deal in Saudi Arabia just to find some certainty.
Because they have to buy an insurance policy against volatility. Ethiopian Airlines is facing aviation fuel costs that have surged from 40% of their operating expenses to an overwhelming 56% in just 1 year.
That is a staggering jump.
It is. And keep in mind the scale of their operations. They burn through an estimated 3.2 billion liters of jet fuel annually just to keep their Boeing 777s and Airbus A350s in the sky.
And they're trying to protect a massive $30 billion 117 aircraft order book, so they need cost predictability to survive. And it's not just them. ACY Airlines, which Ethiopian Airlines has a major stake in, is trying to expand its West African hub in Lomé.
Right, they want to double their fleet with a $350 million investment.
Yeah, and launch these highly lucrative routes to Paris and London, but they are getting absolutely crushed by the same fuel math.
The structural disadvantages operating on the continent are just severe. Asky's CEO recently noted that their aircraft fuel prices have surged 90% over a very short window.
Wait, I'm stuck on something here. We constantly hear about Africa's abundant natural resources, the crude exports, and the incredible renewable energy potential. Why on earth are African airlines paying 35% more for aircraft fuel than airlines in the rest of the world?
It's incredibly frustrating, I know.
Is this just poor corporate management, or is something structurally broken in the supply chain?
It comes down to structural bottlenecks,
Well,
mostly in refining and taxation. First, there's a critical lack of domestic refining capacity. A country might pump crude oil out of the ground.
export it and then have to buy back the highly refined, expensive jet fuel from foreign refineries.
Exactly. And second, governments often layer heavy taxation on top of that imported fuel to generate revenue. And third, you have state-owned airport monopolies dominating ground handling and fuel storage.
Which removes the market competition that naturally drives operational costs down in, like, European hubs.
Precisely.
But we hear so much about sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, as the silver bullet for these exact problems. Why aren't we doing that?
Well, Ethiopian Airlines actually initiated a domestic SAF project with the Ethiopian Mineral Corporation to produce fuel locally.
Oh, really? What happened?
It stalled entirely. The foreign partners who were supposed to secure the project's finance pulled out, and it loops right back to the capital vacuum we discussed with the federal budget. Without robust project finance, these localized solutions just remain blueprints.
Wow. So the lack of available capital and heavy state-mandated costs keep the grand ambitions of our airlines grounded. Moving down the chain reaction, that exact same dynamic of fiscal extraction is hitting the streets of Addis Ababa. It's driving local transport operators right off the road. Let's get into the rollout of the new ETH smart license plates.
Right, so the Addis Ababa Driver and Vehicle Licensing Control Authority mandated these new smart plates, which feature microchips and matching windshield tags.
And the stated policy goal is data analysis, improved road safety, and curbing illicit transport operations.
Which sounds completely reasonable in a press release.
Totally. But the actual execution reveals a very different motive. The government originally projected the cost target at a somewhat manageable 11,000 birr. But the reality for drivers arriving on the newly opened distribution centers is drastically different.
Yeah, the prices are nowhere near 11,000.
Right. Take the story of Salamowit Kasahun. She went to collect plates for a vehicle she bought with a bank loan, only to be hit with an unannounced 56,000 birr fee.
Which is wild because industry insiders estimate the actual raw material cost, the standard aluminum required for a single plate, it hovers around 300 birr. The markup is just astronomical.
And furthermore, this rollout is accompanied by mandatory retraining and relicensing fees for veteran drivers who already hold certifications from accredited schools.
Yeah, we read about Abraham Ashalu, a veteran taxi driver. He already spends 23,000 birr every single month just on spare parts to keep his car operational.
Because the price of basic engine oil has jumped sevenfold.
Exactly. And now he is forced to pay for redundant tests and hyperinflated plates. Nuruddin Didimo, a union leader who has been navigating these streets for 44 years, said it best. He said, "The government has turned the taxi driver into a money-making machine."
So what does this all mean? It's basically like a landlord forcing a tenant to buy a shiny new, overpriced door while the foundation of the house is actively sinking. The smart plates are no longer a public service, they are a hidden tax.
That's a great way to put it. And if we look at the analysis of automotive instructors like Abi Aline, he points out that this is an intentional fiscal shift.
A shift towards what?
Revenue targets. Things like traffic fines and mandated hardware upgrades are morphing from safety tools into pure revenue generation mechanisms. They're designed to feed that starved national budget we discussed in the first segment.
So the extraction just flows downhill. The federal government can't borrow internationally, so they extract from the administrative level, which in turn extracts from the taxi driver who's just trying to afford brake pads. And this economic desperation is bleeding directly into the fight for basic shelter, where inflation and regulatory shocks are fundamentally voiding social contracts.
The fallout is highly visible in the civil courts right now. They're facing massive docket backlogs. We're tracking two seemingly different but mechanically identical stories here: the Key Housing lawsuit and the Burhan Bank labor dispute.
Let's start with Key Housing. 236 homebuyers are actively suing for the restitution of 29 million birr.
Because these buyers bought into an off-plan real estate scheme that promised a 10-year delivery guarantee for a home. And crucially, this guarantee was backed by an individual performance guarantee bond from Bunnan Insurance.
Right, the buyers literally paid extra premiums for this specific insurance to protect their life savings in case the developer failed to deliver.
However, the National Bank of Ethiopia, the central financial regulator, intervened. They issued a decision declaring that this specific underwriting policy was invalid under existing financial directives.
Wait, why would they do that?
The regulator's logic was based on risk exposure limits. They determined the scale of these individual performance bonds violated the limits set for a single insurance firm, basically aiming to prevent a systemic collapse of the insurer. So Bunnan Insurance immediately revoked the policies.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The very insurance policy that everyday buyers purchase to protect themselves from risk
Was invalidated by the central regulator, whose mandate is to protect the stability of the market.
Yes, the tragic irony. By saving the insurance company from overexposure, they completely erased the safety net for 236 families. And the courtroom scenes are chaotic. The buyers couldn't even get oral arguments heard due to the sheer volume of delayed cases.
Yeah, instead, their legal counsel is submitting CDs containing TikTok videos as primary evidence.
TikTok videos.
Yeah, the plaintiff submitted footage downloaded from Key Housing's official TikTok account. The video clearly shows the company allocating newly finished houses to brand new buyers through a randomized raffle system.
While the early subscribers, the ones sitting in court seeking their guaranteed homes, are left with absolutely nothing.
Exactly. It exposes how erratic the fulfillment of corporate obligations becomes when the regulatory framework shifts abruptly.
And then you have the Burhan Bank labor dispute. This started as a localized fight over a housing allowance meant to buffer employees against the rising cost of living. Management authorized an 800 to 10,000 birr monthly housing allowance specifically for clerical staff to prevent them from resigning.
But they entirely excluded thousands of non-clerical workers: the cleaners, the security guards, the drivers.
Which naturally caused a massive issue.
Right. Those non-clerical workers mobilized through their established union, the Burhan Bank Basic Labor Union, or BBBLU. They petitioned the Labor Relations Board, which eventually ruled in their favor, ordering the bank to pay the minimum 800 birr allowance across the board.
But the underlying math of the economy wouldn't let the dispute settle, right?
No, it didn't. The conflict immediately escalated into a fight over months of retroactive arrears. And then it completely derailed into a bizarre legal stalemate over jurisdiction because a newly formed union, the Burhan Family Basic Labor Union, BFBLU, emerged, claiming the original union no longer held the legal authority to negotiate on behalf of the workers.
So you have cleaners and guards whose salaries are already dissolving in real time, just left waiting in a legal limbo, while two competing unions fight over who gets to hold the microphone at the negotiating table.
This raises an important question regarding how we legally define corporate obligation in an era of hyperinflation, because both the Key Housing developer failing to deliver units and the Burhan Bank struggling to formalize a living wage are symptoms of the exact same macroeconomic disease.
Yeah, the real takeaway here is that hyperinflation doesn't just make everyday things expensive, it fundamentally voids the rules of the social contracts we rely on to function. I mean, a 10-year housing guarantee or a fixed-wage labor contract inherently assumes the economy will look roughly the same tomorrow as it does today.
Exactly. When the currency devalues and costs explode, the legal language binding the builder to the buyer or the employer to the employee just collapses. Those contracts become worthless paper, leaving everyday citizens to fight over a shrinking pie in backlogged courts.
We have watched this chain reaction hit national budgets, stall massive airline expansions, crush taxi drivers, and break housing and labor contracts. But to truly understand the granular human impact of this macroeconomy, we have to look at the absolute most basic necessity for biological survival.
A sip of drinking water.
Exactly. The retail price of bottled water across Addis Ababa has experienced a severe sudden surge. A standard 2-liter bottle has jumped from 40 birr to 60 birr in a matter of just 3 months.
And the smaller 300 milliliter bottles jump from 15 birr to 20 birr.
Now, it's important to challenge the framing that frequently surrounds bottled water. In many global contexts, it's viewed as a convenience, or a premium lifestyle choice.
Right.
That is not the reality here. We read the story of Alamihu's maid, a local miller earning a fixed salary of 7,000 burrs a month. He doesn't buy bottled water out of convenience. He buys it because he has been severely weakened by successive bouts of typhoid and typhus, and his doctor issued strict orders prohibiting him from consuming the municipal tap water.
So it's life or death for him.
Truly. Alamihu is forced to spend 1,000 burr a month, a massive unavoidable deduction from his 7,000 burr salary, just to hydrate without his body shutting down.
It acts as a public health necessity masquerading as a consumer retail good. In specific neighborhoods where municipal water infrastructure expansion hasn't matched population growth, or where the existing piping is degraded and the water quality is untrusted, the local kiosk functionally replaces the state utility provider.
Exactly. Then there's Malata Berra, a freelancer navigating the city. She's spending up to 3,000 burr a month on bottled water. That is 15% of her total income. Yeah, and because of her erratic work schedule and the high cost of electricity, she simply doesn't have the time or resources to systematically boil and filter tap water between jobs. For people living in these infrastructure gaps, buying bottled water functions as a mandatory private tax. They have to pay a premium out of pocket to compensate for the failure of public infrastructure.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains the mechanism behind the price hike and seamlessly ties this entire deep dive together. The local water distributors aren't primarily driving this through price gouging. No, they're absorbing severe freight hikes triggered by global energy shocks, such as maritime blockades and the Strait of Hormuz, which drastically increase the cost of diesel required to run their delivery trucks.
Oh wait, the exact same global fuel shocks that are destroying the operating margins of Ethiopian Airlines and ask your why?
Precisely the same mechanism.
Yeah.
But it goes one layer deeper into the supply chain. Think about the plastic bottles themselves. The domestic water bottling industry relies almost entirely on imported polyethylene terephthalate, or peat resin. Ethiopia imported over $82 million worth of peat in 2023, with roughly 80% of that raw material originating from China.
I see.
And because it is an international import, the bottling companies require hard foreign exchange to complete the purchase.
Oh, I see where this is going. Because Ethiopia imports significantly more than it exports, the central bank has to tightly ration all available foreign currency.
Yes. And as we discussed in the very first segment, when the federal government commands the lion's share of those scarce dollars just to service its debt burden, the local water bottler literally cannot convert their burr into the dollars needed to buy plastic from China.
So the resulting supply shortage of peat resin drives up the local manufacturing cost, which is immediately passed down to the consumer.
Exactly.
Wow. The macro cycle is complete. The price of Alamihu's water bottle spikes by 50% because the peat resin from China is scarce. The resin is scarce because the bottler cannot access foreign exchange.
Right.
And the foreign exchange is inaccessible because it's being aggressively drained to pay off the historical national debt that Finance Minister Ahmed Shide is trying to manage within his 2.34 trillion birr budget.
It is an inescapable microcosm of the Ethiopian macroeconomy. The heavy systemic debt treadmill operating at the highest levels of government physically dictates the retail price of survival at the lowest levels of the street.
We've taken a real journey today through the pages of Fortune. We started by looking at a staggering 2.34 trillion birr federal budget and the capital starvation stalling multi-billion-dollar international airline expansions.
Yeah, it's quite the chain reaction.
We mapped how those top-level macroeconomic pressures cascade downward, manifesting as hidden taxes on veteran taxi drivers forced to buy inflated smart plates. We saw it shatter the foundational assumptions of both housing and labor contracts in the civil courts. And finally, we tracked it all the way down into the hands of a miller who is just trying to afford clean water without going broke.
The through line connecting these events is undeniable. Abstract economic vocabulary, terms like recurrent expenditure, forex rationing, and supply chain volatility, they are not just academic concepts reserved for central bankers.
No, they're the invisible hands physically setting the prices on the shelves of your local kiosk today. They dictate whether your neighborhood taxi driver can afford to stay in business, or if your legally binding contract for a future home actually holds any weight when the market shifts.
Recognizing these underlying mechanisms fundamentally changes how you interpret the daily friction of the city around you.
It truly does. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We have clearly seen how fragile these formal interconnected systems are, how easily a maritime disruption in the Strait of Hormuz or a strict regulatory pen stroke at the central bank can disrupt everything from international aviation to your access to drinking water. So, if basic survival essentials like shelter and clean water are increasingly vulnerable to volatile global supply chains and rigid top-down mandates, how will local communities begin to build real, sustainable resilience outside of these formal, fragile systems when the next global shock inevitably hits?
That question might just define the economic reality of the next decade.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the newsroom's latest sources. We love unpacking these chain reactions with you. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking what's driving the motion outside your window. Goodbye.
Take care, everyone. Goodbye.